But to do that, the motion to table, which I understand is about to be made, needs to be defeated. And I yield the floor.
Yield for a question.
I'd be happy.
Could I ask, first of all, I'd also like to thank you and the Senator from Oklahoma for your leadership and hard work on this legislation, and I congratulate you on the great work you have done. But could I ask you, is this the first time in 51 years that a defense authorization bill will be voted on without debate or any amendment?
There was debate and amendment on this bill the week before Thanksgiving, so it would not be...
Excuse me, without extended debate and addressing the issues of sexual assault, NSA, detainees. Are any of those issues been addressed by debate and amendment on the floor of the Senate?
Well, the sexual assault amendments which were pending, as my good friend from Arizona knows, were debated. There were about 20-plus sexual assault amendments that are in the bill, so it makes major advance in that area. But in terms of the two amendments that the Senator, I think, is referring to, the Senator McCaskill's and Senator Gillibrand's amendment, there was about a day-long debate on that, and there was an effort to vote on them. And I think everybody wanted to vote on those two amendments, but there was objection to it. In terms of what the Senator, I believe, is driving at also, is that there was a time in I think it was the 2011 or 2012 Defense Authorization Bill where, in fact, we adopted the bill by unanimous consent. I think there was no debate on the bill that was finally adopted. Having said that, I happen to agree that this is not the ideal way to adopt a defense bill. I have said that over and over again. And I've pointed out that the way in which we tried to at least get some amendments adopted, including about 30 that had been agreed to, had been cleared, that we couldn't even get those added. Now, with Senator Inhofe's help, we were able to get much of the material in those amendments that were worked out between us and the House leaders so that they are in this bill. Not all the amendments that have been cleared, but many of them. But I happen to agree with my friends. This is not the ideal way to proceed. But we're at now where we are at. And if we simply reopen this bill and do not adopt it the way it is, it then has to go back to the House of Representatives, and then there would not be a defense bill with all of the problems which would be created for our troops and their families. So this is the best we can do. It's not ideal.
Well, could I just finally say to Senator, I've never seen a process like this before. Maybe there have been some parallels, number one. Number two is that here we are on December the 19th of 2013, I believe it is, and we passed the bill through the committee in May. So here we are many months later taking up the bill because the majority's priorities were obviously not to bring up the defense authorization bill until it was so late that we're forced into this cramped procedure. And there's no doubt, I thank the Senator and my distinguished chairman, but the fact is we haven't debated this bill. We haven't debated NSA. We haven't debated this issue of sexual assault with two different opinion the sanctions, the detainee issue, all of those issues. I remember in the markup we said, well, we'll wait until it's so important we'll debate and amend this on the floor. So I don't think we've done the men and women who are serving in the military anything but a gross disservice by, in December, having a bill rammed through the Senate of the United States of America, and that is because of a lack of priorities on the part of leadership. We could have taken this bill to the floor of the Senate in June. We didn't, and it's shameful.
Madam President. Madam President, I know the distinguished ranking member of the Armed Services Committee is here. I would be glad to yield to him, and if I can retain the right to the floor, I think he has a few comments he wanted to make in response to the chairman. If I can do that, I would ask unanimous consent to do so.
Is there objection? Without objection, Senator from Oklahoma.
Let me make just a couple of comments here. Oddly enough, I agree with everything the senator from Arizona said. It's true, and the senator from Texas. The process was terrible, and I've been here for, well, I guess on this House committee and this committee for 22 years, and I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. But the effort was there to have a bill early on. I know working very closely with the chairman, I've never had an opportunity to work that close with someone in developing a bill, but we did. I know it was his desire to have a bill, and it's still his desire to have a bill. The problem is we went through the thing of the option that everyone finds so offensive and I find so offensive, and it's changed the Senate, and the evidence of that is what happened in this bill. We had people who wanted to have amendments. And so what I did, I went on a Thursday, I recall that, to a Republican lunch. And I went there with 25 amendments. And I said, would you all agree to cut your amendment request, which was over 100, down to 25, if I can take it and show it to the other side and see if that's acceptable? They agreed to that. I want to repeat that. The Republicans agreed to a maximum of 25 amendments. So I went over. I could not get an agreement on the other side. So that effort was there. Now, as far as the amendments are concerned, the chairman has said several times that we considered these amendments. We did. To be specific, 79 amendments we put in this bill, of which over half of them were Republican amendments. And so we tried our best to put everything that was in there, and it got down to the point is, do we want a bill or do we not want a bill? So I want to just emphasize that this is not on the merits of the bill. The bill is a good bill. We've addressed, and you've heard us more than you want to hear us talk about what all is in this bill. It is a good bill. I think it might be better than the bill that we passed out, and maybe even the House bill. But nonetheless, it's down to that or nothing, and that's for that reason I think we have to have the bill. But I agree, the process, we have to keep talking about how bad the process was to make sure that never happens again. We as minorities are entitled to have our amendments, the same as the other side, when they become minorities, are going to be entitled to have their amendments. With that, I'll yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, just to clarify, I believe the Defense Authorization Bill will pass this evening, and that's not in any doubt. The problem is that because this isn't just about the process, this isn't just about minority rights in the Senate, this is about people getting hurt. And the people I'm talking about are our active duty military whose pensions have been cut by the vote we cast yesterday passing the budget deal. And all we want to do is fix it. You know, there's bipartisan consensus that this is a big mistake. And we could pass that, if the majority leader would allow us, today. And it would pass through the House like as I said yesterday, like a hot knife through butter. I mean, everyone agrees this is a mistake, and that's what the process is supposed to do, to fix this kind of error before it happens, and now that it has happened, to remedy it through an amendment. But this is exactly what the majority leader is denying us the opportunity to do, and why this is so important. And I mentioned, just lest they not be forgotten, the 12 Americans who were killed at Fort Hood some 4 years ago by a domestic terrorist attack, along with 30 others whose lives were changed forever when they were shot by Major Nadal Hassan, who'd become radicalized by the same cleric who President Obama targeted on his kill list with the drone attack in Yemen, and appropriately so. He was an agent of al-Qaeda. But to now call this workplace violence and to not to give us a chance to recognize the loss of lives in an act of war, and to make sure that these patriots get the benefits that they're entitled to, is just wrong. So it's not just about the process, it's not just about minority rights, it's about real people getting hurt and our ability to fix that today, but that's being denied as a result of this process. I would just conclude by saying the distinguished senator from Arizona is exactly right. The average number of amendments since 1996 on the National Defense Authorization Bill is 138 amendments. 138 amendments. The average number of recorded votes, 11.5. The number of days that we've been on the bill, 8.8 is the average. So this is a big important, profoundly significant piece of legislation, yet it's being jammed through here in about 24 hours without any opportunity to offer amendments. Madam President, parliamentary inquiry. Is it correct that no senator is permitted to offer an amendment to the House-passed defense bill while the majority leader's motion to concur with a further amendment is pending?
The senator is correct.
Further parliamentary inquiry, Madam President. If a motion to table the Reid amendment to concur with a further amendment is successful, would there be an opportunity to offer my amendment number 2602? This is the Fort Hood Purple Heart bill.
The senator is correct.
Madam President, in order to offer that amendment and others that I believe would be in order and should be allowed to be offered, I move to table the pending Reid motion to concur with the further amendment, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Aya. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Yes. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Burr, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Graham, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Scott, Sessions, Vitter, Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Heitkamp, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Levin, Markey, Menendez, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, Wyden. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Paul, aye. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado, no. Mr. Donnelly, no. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Booker, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Cardin, no. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Carper, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Ms. Landrieu, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Nelson, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Begich, no. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. King, no. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, no.
Is anyone wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 45, the nays are 55. The motion to table is not agreed to. Senator from Michigan. Motion without objection.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
The senator from Minnesota.
I would ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection, if the senator will hold for one moment. The Senate will be in order. The Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations outside the chamber. The senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about some of the important things we can be doing to help strengthen our economic recovery and to get more Minnesotans and more Americans across the country into jobs. During the government shutdown in October, I came to the floor to talk about how the shutdown was preventing us from doing the work that people sent us here to do. Every day we spent on the shutdown was a day we weren't working together to create jobs and to rebuild the middle class. Well, the budget deal we passed this week is far from perfect, but it is my hope that it will enable us to stop lurching from crisis to crisis and to focus on the work that we were sent here to do. This agreement means that businesses will have the stability and certainty that they need to create jobs and strengthen our economy, and allows us to focus on educating our kids, creating a 21st century workforce, and putting people back to work. Like I said, this budget deal is far from perfect. It's a compromise, and like any compromise, it has elements that I like and elements that I don't like and elements that others like and don't like that may be different. In addition to providing some budgetary certainty for the next 2 years, the budget deal undoes some of the extreme across-the-board cuts of the sequester. That will enable us to make more of the critical investments we need to make in education, research and development, and infrastructure. And we will make those investments while replacing the irrational cuts of the sequester with more responsible deficit reduction. In fact, the bill ultimately reduces the debt by about $20 million more than under the previous budget that included the full sequester. At the same time, I'm very troubled by the fact that the bill pays for undoing some of the extreme across-the-board cuts of the sequester, in part by reducing some military pensions. That was something that was pushed for by the lead Republican negotiator, and I'm not happy about it. I believe there are cuts that we can make to defense spending, but cutting military pensions isn't one of them. That's why I'm co-sponsoring a bill by Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire that would replace those cuts to military pensions by closing an indefensible and wasteful corporate tax loophole, and I hope that we can get that done before the cut to military pensions goes into effect. I'm also very troubled that the budget deal does not include an extension of critical emergency unemployment insurance. Extending this unemployment insurance is one of the things we need to be doing for the economy. Too many Americans remain unemployed, and those who have been employed the longest are facing the expiration of their unemployment insurance when they need it the most. 65,000 workers in Minnesota and millions throughout our country may need this extended unemployment insurance in 2014. These folks are struggling. They're struggling to find jobs and to support their families. Not extending unemployment insurance will also put the brakes on our economic recovery. In 2011, the CBO wrote that aid to the unemployed is among the policies with, quote, the largest effects on output and employment per dollar of budgetary cost. And without an extension, the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that the economy will generate 240,000 fewer jobs by the end of 2014. That's why I've been working to continue the extension of unemployment insurance, and I will keep pushing for the Senate to take up and pass extension when we return in the new year. Another thing we should do to strengthen the economy and help working Americans is to raise the minimum wage. We established the minimum wage because we believe that no one should work full-time, contributing to society, and live in poverty. Americans value work. We work more hours on average than citizens in other developed countries. The minimum wage is supposed to help guarantee that if you work hard and play by the rules, you will at least have a roof over your head and you'll be able to put food on the table. This year marks 75 years with the federal minimum wage. However, today, because the minimum wage is too low, it is not doing what it's supposed to do. Today, a minimum wage worker making $7.25 an hour or about $15,000 per year falls below the poverty line, even though they work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. And inflation has eroded the value of the minimum wage. If the minimum wage has simply kept pace with inflation since 1968, not raised in real terms, but just kept pace with inflation, kept pace with it, it would be at $10.75 an hour today. That is a wage that would at least keep a family of three above the poverty line. What has happened to the minimum wage is part of a larger trend for American workers. Over the past 50 years, American workers have increased their productivity by 135% increase. But the value of their wages has not changed. And the real value of the minimum wage has dropped by 33% over that same time. Over just the past few years, costs have climbed. Americans are paying more for electricity, rent, auto repair, food, and child care, and many other things. And yet wages for most workers have stagnated, and the minimum wage has fallen. That's why I think that one of the most important ways we can boost our economy and help workers and families is to increase the minimum wage. And Americans agree. Americans strongly favor boosting the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. In a recent survey, 63% supported raising the minimum wage to $10.10 from the current $7.25 rate. Moreover, the support for increasing the minimum wage is broad-based. The rich, the poor, Republicans, and Democrats all believe that we should raise the minimum wage. Increasing the minimum wage will be good for Minnesota, and there is a parallel effort at the state level to increase the state minimum wage. If we increase the federal minimum wage to $10.10, it will affect 462,000 Minnesota workers over 3 years. That's 18% of Minnesota's workforce, and it will increase our state's GDP by almost $400 million. This is something that we must fight for. Extending unemployment benefits and increasing the minimum wage are crucial things that we can be doing to support the American value that if you work hard, you should be able to support yourself and your family. There is more that we can be doing. I am part of the Manufacturing Jobs for America initiative that several of my colleagues in the Senate and headed up by the presiding officer, have undertaken. As part of that initiative, I want to talk about an issue that I've spoken about on the floor before and that I hear about from manufacturers all over Minnesota, the skills gap. Now, what is the skills gap? Well, recent studies have shown that between 1/3 and 1/2 of manufacturers in my state of Minnesota have at least one job that they can't fill because they can't find a worker with the right skills to fill that job. That is the skills gap in Minnesota, but it isn't just Minnesota. This is a nationwide phenomenon. As I roam this floor to talk to my colleagues, every one of them knows this phenomenon in their state. A 2011 survey by Deloitte found that there were 600,000 manufacturing jobs nationwide that were unfilled because of a skills shortage. And it's not just manufacturers either. There's a skills gap in information technology and healthcare and other sectors that have jobs sitting there waiting for skilled workers to fill them. There are more than 3 million jobs in this country that could be filled today if there were workers who had the right skills. With too many Americans unemployed, we have to find a way to fill those jobs. And the thing is, we know how to solve this. We're taking steps to solve it in communities in Minnesota and around the country through partnerships between businesses and community and technical colleges that are training up workers and getting them into high-demand jobs right away. Let me talk briefly about an innovative program to bridge the skills gap in Minnesota. I recently visited the Right Skills Now program at Dunwoody College of Technology in Minneapolis, and the South Central Community and Technical College in Mankato. Those two institutions working on this together. At South Central, I sat with about 8 to 10 manufacturers who had helped fund and design their program that gives workers the skills they need to operate a computer numerical control system, or CNC machine. They told me that between them they had, between 8 or 10 of them, they had more than 50 job openings that they could fill that instant. At Dunwoody, their current placement rate from the Right Skills Now program is 91%. You'll have a hard time finding a more effective program. Dunwoody likes to emphasize that its students often come into the program after having just been laid off, or that they're the long-term employee that we hear about. And after going through the program, they're placing 91% of them into good jobs in a growing industry here in this country. They told me about a student who had a successful career as a massage therapist. He was doing just fine until he began to experience pain from pre-arthritic symptoms. That spells trouble for a massage therapist. So he researched technical programs and joined Right Skills Now, and after going through the program, he relaunched his career as a machinist. Careers are different from what they were a generation ago. Very few people stay working in one job for one company their entire life anymore. Whether it's because of changing life circumstances, like the massage therapist turned machinist, or because of new technologies, most workers have many different jobs over the course of their working life now, and those jobs require many different skills. We need a workforce development system that is agile enough to keep up with those changing demands. That is essential not just so workers will be able to get the different skills they need over the course of their working lives, it's also going to be one of the keys to the United States remaining globally competitive. If our workers can't adapt to the new industries that are constantly forming, we will lose those jobs to our global competitors. There is no better way to anticipate and to react to these changes than to connect businesses directly with our schools to get workers exactly what they need. This is also about college affordability. I've talked before about Eric Ajax. He's CEO of E.J. Ajax & Sons, the metal stamping and sheet metal fabrication company in Fridley, Minnesota, that was founded by Eric's grandfather in 1945. Eric and other manufacturers partnered with Hennepin Technical College in Hennepin County to set up Empowered, a fast-track training program to get workers what they needed for entry-level advanced manufacturing jobs. Eric gave me an example of one of his workers that I found just exciting. This is what excites me. And not because that it's extraordinary, it's because it's something that we can duplicate over and over and over again in this country. When he hires employees from these business technical college partnerships, the way he looks at it is that they are on a career ladder that would otherwise not be available. He told me about one such hire who was really good at his job. So Eric sent him back to school to get his associate's degree. The guy came back to work, continued to be a star, and a few years later, Eric paid for him to go to the University of Minnesota, where he got his bachelor's degree. And the guy is now head of quality control for E.J. Ajax, an incredibly high-skilled job at an advanced manufacturing company. Now, understand, this guy graduated from college with no debt, zero debt, with a great job. When I think about college affordability, I think about that story. Now, as I've said, we have a skills gap problem in manufacturing and in other industries, and we have these partnerships that are successfully working to close that gap. So where do we come in here in Congress? Well, I've gone around to Minnesota community and technical colleges and talked to businesses and had roundtables, and I've talked to national experts in our state and from around the country, and the fact is we are not doing this fast enough. And sometimes these partnerships could do a lot more, train up a lot more people with some extra funding, maybe to buy a really sophisticated machine or to hire an instructor with very specialized skills. So what I'm proposing is a competitive grant program in a bill called the Community College to Career Fund Act. Under this program, businesses and community colleges would apply for grants based on how many jobs their partnership would create, what the value of those jobs would be to those hired, to their company, to the community, and how much skin do the businesses have in the game, or maybe how much the college, community college, and the businesses and the state has in the game. We have millions of open jobs that can't be filled because of a skills shortage. And we know that these partnerships are the most direct way to fill those jobs. And we know that existing partnerships aren't doing enough and can't do enough, and they need more resources in order to truly meet the need that exists. So that's exactly what my bill would address. So as we move forward with this budget deal, let's build on the progress it represents and set our sights a little higher. Let's support working families and help people who are struggling to find a job in today's slowly recovering economy. Let's help students and young people who have been held back by slow job growth to get a foothold in the economy. And let's support partnerships between businesses and community and technical colleges to fill the jobs that are out there. Let's make this coming year the year that Congress works for Americans and puts Americans back to work. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, first let me commend my colleague from Minnesota and tell him that I proudly co-sponsor his legislation. I've had visits throughout my state with community colleges and watched